The technique I'm going to be showing you today is couching, but couching with a colour. So come and join me. Got our nice little Jap circle just on there, and we're going to put another Jap circle just on the inside, but we're actually going to use a coloured thread. So I'm going to plunge this down just here. Take it down to the fabric. Pull it through there gently. And then just make sure that this comes up and around this way. So I'm using a nice purple thread. Purple is my favourite colour, so it goes without saying that it's quite nice to use your favourite colour on your pieces of work. So it's really important to secure these off at the back. You can do that before or you can do that afterwards. I'm just going to lay this thread inside, and again it's really quite important to make sure that your stitch is the same width as the thread. And I'm doing a bit of brick stitch just here, so I'm bringing each one of these stitches, you can see my first row of stitches there which are in the translucent thread, and I'm doing a second row of stitches just there which is in between each one of the first row. Threads come out, so I'll just have to rethread that. Okay. Now again, I'm just going to bring that round the thread and just nicely hold that inside that first row. So we'll just arrange that in a nice way there. So it'll just form nicely inside that first row there. So we're just going to come up in between each one of those stitches, and again your stitch is just the width of the first row. Okay. Down into there. So your stitches, as you can see, are all the same width as your thread. That's really quite important, and because otherwise you'll get quite a big gap here. So I'm just going to lay that in just there, just lift that slightly, and then it just falls nicely in that curved gap. And again, this is really quite important here to make sure that you do get it nice and tight up against that first row. Otherwise the gap could get bigger, so you could end up with a big gap like that if you didn't stitch it closely. So really important at this stage. So we're just coming up and down over the Jap thread and up against our first row. Now sometimes the second row, because you're being a bit more careful with exactly where your stitches are, actually takes a little bit longer than the first row. So possibly this video will be slightly longer than the first one, but we'll see when we get to the end of it anyway. And you'll see also in this area here the stitches are about the same width. As it gets to the curve, the stitches actually are closer together than that first row. And the reason behind that is because obviously it is a curve, and your rows will actually get shorter and your stitches will actually get closer in the further on you go with those stitches. So what I need to do now is I just need to give that a nice little stitch before and afterwards. As we did before, we're going to do a little, so we've got our little before stitch just there, and then we're going to do a little stitch just here, and then we're going to do one slightly further down, get a nice point on that. Okay, and then we're going to put our stitch afterwards, and again we're not bothering too much at this stage. I'm actually just going to come up just there, just to make sure that my stitch is the width of the jap. Sometimes it's easier to lie your jap flat and see where you need to come up, and other times it's easier to do it afterwards. So I'm going to just push that in there, and what I'm going to do is come up with that next stitch, and then we can tweak that thread. Okay, so I'm just going to pull that down just a little bit, do that next stitch over like that, bring that down, and then I can give that corner a little tweak to make it more pointy. So I'm just going to give that a little bit of a tweak now. There we go, so it's made it nice and pointy. Now when you pull these in, it'll straighten that up nicely. So again, I'm just holding this thread into that nice curve there. And these are much smaller stitches on this side. So we're almost 2 millimeters apart, these ones, which is around about 1/8 of an inch there, and then they'll start to widen again as they get further around and you get back onto the straights. So as you're coming into that inside curve, they always go much closer together, but then they'll come much further apart again when we get back onto the straight there. So they're all really nicely, tightly inside that first row, and that's nicely lying against that first row. As I said, if your stitches are too far away and they're much wider than your actual thread, then you'll get big gaps between that first row and your second row. But this purple is just bringing in a really nice shade into our heart. Got a purple heart, bit of a purple heart there. So we're nearly finished now. We're just coming up to our last few stitches. And it's really quite nicely tight in there. Now when we get to the next stitch, we have got to think about where we're plunging, so I'm only going to do one more stitch here before I plunge, and then obviously I need to then, I'm actually going to come up just where I need to do that very last stitch. So my last stitch is just going to be there. I'm just going to pop that on there to hold that in place, and then I'm going to plunge my thread through the fabric. So I'm just going to plunge it right up against that last row nice and tightly there, and take those two ends, poke them through the eye of the needle there. It's a nice big eyed needle, so it should be easy to poke them through. And then we're just going to pull that down, give it a little wiggle there, and it takes it down through to the fabric. Now here, this is a perfect example. So this is actually twisted over slightly, can you see? Now you need to make sure that that's not twisted. So to do that, you would just twist them behind on the back. So if you grab the two threads at the back and just pull them back, it will then nicely form that straight row, and you can just finish that off by doing your last stitch just there, and you've got that nice inner row of purple. And obviously you need to over sew those threads